Imagine waking up tomorrow, reaching for your phone, and finding it completely dead. Not just out of battery, dead. Lifeless. A useless piece of glass and metal. You try the charger. Nothing. You flip the light switch. Darkness. You turn the key in your car. Silence. Every single piece of technology on Earth has stopped working. Forever. This isn't science fiction. This is a journey into a world where humanity must face its greatest challenge, surviving without the very tools that built modern civilization. What would happen if all technology vanished overnight? The first 24 hours would be chaos. Absolute chaos. Planes would fall from the sky as their electronic systems failed. Trains would screech to a halt on their tracks. Cars would become metal coffins blocking every road. Hospitals would plunge into darkness, their life support machines going silent. For millions of people dependent on medical technology, dialysis patients, those on ventilators, people with pacemakers, the consequences would be immediate and devastating. Cities would transform into dangerous labyrinths within hours. Without traffic lights, intersections would become battlegrounds. Without refrigeration, food would begin to spoil. Without communication networks, families would be separated with no way to reach each other. Imagine the terror of not knowing if your loved ones are safe, with no phone, no internet, no way to find out. People would flood the streets, desperate for information, for help, for answers that nobody could provide. The panic would be unlike anything humanity has ever experienced. Grocery stores would be ransacked within the first day as people scrambled to secure supplies. But here's the terrifying truth. Most of our food supply depends entirely on technology. The trucks that deliver goods, the refrigerated warehouses, the computerized inventory systems, all gone. Modern agriculture relies on tractors, irrigation systems, pesticides produced in factories. Without these, our ability to feed 7 billion people would collapse overnight. Water would become the first crisis. Most urban water systems depend on electric pumps to move water through pipes and treatment plants to make it safe. Within days, taps would run dry. People would be forced to seek natural water sources, rivers, lakes, wells, but without treatment, waterborne diseases would spread rapidly. Cholera, dysentery, typhoid, diseases we've nearly eliminated, would return with a vengeance. The death toll in the first month would be catastrophic. Experts estimate that without modern medicine, sanitation, and food distribution, billions could die. The very young and the very old would be most vulnerable. Those with chronic illnesses would have no access to the medications keeping them alive. Insulin-dependent diabetics, people with heart conditions, transplant recipients, their survival would suddenly depend on luck and rapidly dwindling supplies. But humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. Those who survived the initial shock would begin to rebuild. And here's where our story truly begins, because the world without technology wouldn't just be about loss. It would be about rediscovery. Communities would reform around the most fundamental human need: cooperation. In cities, survivors would band together in neighborhoods, sharing resources and skills. The knowledge economy would be replaced by a skills economy. Suddenly, the software engineer and the hedge fund manager would have far less value than the carpenter, the farmer, the blacksmith, the herbalist. Those who understood how to grow food, build shelter, purify water, and heal without modern medicine would become the most valuable members of society. Education would undergo a complete transformation. Schools as we know them would cease to exist. Without textbooks printed in factories, without computers or even electric lights, knowledge would be passed down orally and through hand-copied manuscripts, just as it was for thousands of years. Apprenticeship would return as the primary form of learning. Children would learn by doing, farming alongside their parents, crafting tools with skilled artisans, understanding medicine through observation and practice. Agriculture would revert to pre-industrial methods, but with one crucial advantage: we'd retain the knowledge of crop rotation, selective breeding, and basic irrigation techniques developed over centuries. Communities would need to relocate closer to arable land and water sources. The great urban centers, New York, Tokyo, London, would gradually empty as people moved to regions where they could actually grow food and access clean water. Seasons would dictate life again in ways we've forgotten. Winter would become a time of genuine hardship. Without central heating, without the ability to import food from warmer climates, people in colder regions would face brutal choices. Some communities would migrate seasonally, following patterns abandoned centuries ago. Others would develop sophisticated food preservation techniques, smoking, salting, drying, fermenting, to survive the lean months. Medicine would return to herbal remedies and traditional healing practices, but with the accumulated knowledge of anatomy, germ theory, and surgical technique. Imagine doctors who understand that infections are caused by bacteria but have no antibiotic. They would rely on antiseptic plants, garlic, honey, certain tree barks, that our ancestors used. Surgery would still be possible, but incredibly dangerous. A simple appendicitis, easily treated today, could become a death sentence. Life expectancy would plummet back to pre-industrial levels, perhaps 40 to 50 years on average. Yet amid the hardship, something remarkable would emerge, a reconnection with the natural world. Without artificial light, the night sky would blaze with stars invisible to most modern humans. People would learn to navigate by constellations, to predict weather by observing clouds and animal behavior, to tell time by the sun's position. The rhythm of life would sync with natural cycles, waking with dawn, sleeping after sunset. This might sound romantic, but it would also be exhausting. Every single day would involve physical labor just to meet basic need. Transportation would undergo the most visible transformation. Horses, donkeys, and oxen would once again become humanity's primary engines. But here's a problem. After a century of automobiles, the global horse population is minuscule compared to what we'd need. Breeding sufficient numbers would take decades. In the meantime, people would walk. A journey that takes 2 hours by car might take 2 days on foot. The world would effectively become enormous again. Your entire life might unfold within a 20-mile radius of where you were born. Trade would continue, but slowly. Merchant caravans would travel between communities, exchanging goods much as they did along ancient trade routes. Salt, preserved foods, metals, textiles, and tools would become valuable commodities. A new economy would develop based on barter and eventually on physical currency, likely precious metals that could be weighed and verified without electronic systems. Communication over distance would regress dramatically. Forget instant messages. A letter might take weeks or months to reach its destination, carried by traveling merchants or dedicated messengers. Important news would spread slowly, through word of mouth and hand-copied notices. Families separated by the initial collapse might never reunite, never even learn of each other's fate. The psychological toll of this isolation would be immense for generations who remembered the connected world. Governance would splinter. National governments as we know them require technology to function, to communicate across vast territories, to maintain military control, to collect taxes, to enforce laws. Without these tools, large nations would fracture into smaller, more manageable units. City-states might re-emerge. Local councils and charismatic leaders would fill power vacuums. Some communities would adopt democratic principles remembered from before, others might fall under authoritarian rule. Without the checks and balances that modern communication enables, tyranny would find fertile ground. But not all leadership would be oppressive. Many communities would thrive under cooperative governance, especially those that had maintained strong social bonds. Religious institutions, which existed long before technology, would likely regain enormous influence as sources of moral guidance, education, and community organization. Churches, mosques, temples, and synagogues would become centers of social life once again. The arts would not disappear, they would transform. Without recorded music, Live performance would be the only way to experience song and melody. Storytelling would become a treasured skill. Oral traditions would carry history, teach morals, and preserve the memory of the technological age. Some stories would be accurate, many would gradually morph into myth. Future generations might hear tales of metal birds that flew through the sky and think them legends, like we view stories of dragons. Books would become precious beyond measure. The few printed books surviving from the technological age would be copied by hand, though paper production without industrial mills would be challenging. Knowledge would be concentrated in those communities lucky enough to possess libraries and the scribes to maintain them. Literacy rates would likely fall initially, then stabilize at lower levels. Reading and writing would again become specialized skills, not universal expectations. Science would face the greatest setback. Without laboratories, precision instruments, or the ability to share research globally, scientific progress would slow to a crawl. But it wouldn't stop entirely. Curious minds would still observe, experiment, and draw conclusions. Astronomy could continue with naked-eye observations and handcrafted telescopes using salvaged glass. Botany, zoology, and medicine would advance through careful observation and documentation. However, fields like quantum physics, microbiology, or genetic engineering would become incomprehensible legends, their complexity impossible to explore without technology. Children born into this new world would never know what was lost. To them, this would simply be life. They would learn to read the weather, to grow food, to craft tools with their hands. They might hear stories from their grandparents about the before times, about glowing rectangles that showed moving pictures, about machines that could fly, about talking to someone on the other side of the world instantly. Would they believe these tales? Or would they assume the old folks were exaggerating, remembering dreams rather than reality? The environmental impact would be profound and contradictory. Without industrial pollution, carbon emissions, and plastic production, nature would begin to recover dramatically. Forests would reclaim abandoned cities. Rivers would run cleaner. Animal populations would rebound. Within a few generations, the Earth might look more like it did 500 years ago. Yet this recovery would come at the cost of billions of human lives. It's a dark irony, the planet healing while humanity suffers. But what about rediscovery? Would we eventually rebuild technology? This is where the story becomes fascinating. The knowledge exists in books, in the minds of survivors. We understand physics, chemistry, metallurgy. The challenge is that modern technology stands on a pyramid of previous innovations. You can't build a computer without electricity. You can't have electricity without copper wire, generators, and understanding of electromagnetic principles. You can't refine copper at industrial scales without mining equipment and furnaces. You can't build that equipment without steel. And so on down to the most basic tools. Rebuilding would take centuries, perhaps millennia. The first generation would focus purely on survival. The second might begin recovering lost techniques, better forging methods, improved agriculture, basic mechanical devices like water wheels and windmills. The third generation might develop simple steam engines using preserved knowledge. But each step requires resources, time, and stable societies that can afford to have some members focus on innovation rather than mere survival. There's also the risk that crucial knowledge would be lost forever. Modern science is documented in ways that require technology to access. Digital files would be unreadable. Even printed technical manuals assume a baseline of knowledge and available materials that might not exist. Try explaining how to build a transistor to someone who is struggling to forge a decent iron plow. Some technologies might be reinvented differently, or not at all. Yet human ingenuity is remarkable. Throughout history, humans have overcome incredible obstacles. Small advances would compound over generations. Perhaps in 500 years, our descendants would have rebuilt to an industrial revolution level. In 1,000 years, they might have electricity again. In 2000, who knows? They might even develop technologies we never imagined, taking a different path informed by the mistakes that led to the original collapse. The psychological impact on the survivor generations would be immense and largely overlooked in physical survival discussions. Imagine living with the knowledge of what existed, of miracles that are now impossible. The grief would be overwhelming. Depression and anxiety would be rampant, though without modern psychology or medication, these conditions would be misunderstood and mishandled. Communities with strong support systems and purpose would fare better mentally than those mired in nostalgia and regret. Religion and philosophy would grapple with profound questions. Why did this happen? Was it divine punishment? A natural consequence of hubris? Random catastrophe? Different communities would develop different narratives, and these narratives would shape their cultures for generations. Some might view technology as inherently evil, forbidding attempts to recreate it. Others might worship the lost technological age as a golden era, preserving what artifacts they could as holy relics. As we near the end of this journey, consider what this thought experiment reveals about our current world. We are more dependent on technology than any humans in history. This dependency brings incredible benefits. Longer lives, reduced suffering, instant communication, access to information. But it also creates vulnerability. Our systems are fragile, interconnected, and complex beyond any one person's understanding. This doesn't mean we should reject technology or long for a simpler past. The past was brutal, painful, and short for most people. But perhaps it means we should build resilience into our systems. Preserve practical knowledge. Maintain some low-tech backup. Foster communities that function on human connection, not just digital networks. Learn skills that don't require electricity. Because while a complete technological collapse is unlikely, smaller-scale disruptions are not. Natural disasters, power grid failures, supply chain breakdowns. The world without technology would be unimaginably difficult, especially for the transition generations who remembered what was lost. But it would also be a world where human relationships took center stage, where direct connection to nature was unavoidable, where every day required creativity and problem-solving. It would be a world that demanded the best of human cooperation, or revealed the worst of human selfishness. Ultimately, it would be a world that tested whether humanity's spirit could survive the loss of humanity's tools. Thank you for joining me on this journey through a world transformed. If you enjoyed exploring this what-if scenario, please subscribe to Elseworld Tales for more thought experiments that challenge how we see our reality. Leave a like if this made you think differently about the technology you use every day. And I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. What skills would you want to have in a world without technology? Until next time, keep questioning, keep imagining, and keep exploring the possibilities.